Hello, welcome to OPA GCSE Sociology. This is lesson 17. What is the difference between quantitative and qualitative research? So this is really an introduction into what the next unit will be, next half term, research methods. The do now doesn't apply to us because you would have either had your feedback or you'll be waiting for your feedback in another lesson. It was just based around responding to the front sheet in your half-term assessment and showing you what you've done well and what you perhaps needed to improve upon. So no need to do now. We're going to jump straight into task one and just talk through one or two things before that. So a reminder, sociology is the study of how people live together in society and how they interact in small groups, communities, and large organizations. So it helps to support or prove a political idea and opinions. Everyone has them, but how do we filter through what is right and wrong? And that's one of the reasons why sociology is important. There would be no point in it just being about opinions, unless there's actually evidence and actual research behind it. Okay, everyone's got an opinion, but there's no point in calling yourself a science of society if it's just opinion. Once sociologists prove an opinion or idea right, they're also interested in how they can be constructive and how they can offer solutions. So in an age of fake news, sociology has never been more relevant, really, whether it's acknowledged or not. And the way in which they go about trying to prove an opinion right or go about really trying to offer constructive solutions is by doing social research. Okay, and there's generally two approaches to that. There's a quantitative approach and a qualitative approach. So just for task one, what you're going to do, you've got this table here. You're going to draw this out and get ready, because what we're going to do is we're going to go through each one of these. We're going to go through and see whether it's positivist or interpretivist, which is essentially I'm going to be very la-di-da now, but what sort of epistemology it takes. And it's not something you really need to know in a lot of detail for GCSE, but it's mainly A-level and university, but it does help to get in the mindset of those approaches. We're then going to establish whether they have hypotheses, whether they use samples or what type they use, their methodology, the results, the type of results they want, and what theories generally are associated with it, which approach. And we're going to be very black and white at this. This is GCSE after all. It's not A-level or university. It's very much an introduction level in terms of understanding quantitative, qualitative research. So when I make claims that a theory will be this or they take this approach, that's not always the case. I'm generalizing a little bit here, but it's to make it nice and clear for GCSE level. So there's two approaches. So there's a positivist approach or positivism. And this is the belief that sociology is a science. So there are many sociologists, especially those like the founding fathers or specifically Marx and Durkheim, who think sociology should have similar methodology to that of natural sciences. Okay, and it should try to employ a quantitative research approach. So remember, this is all for the first row, whether it's positivist or interpretivist. And then on the flip side of that, you have the interpretivist approach. Now, this is very much anti-scientific in the sociological community and something that has really developed since the 1960s. It's been there before with the likes of Weber, had a movement with people like Herbert Mead, and even in social psychology with people like Erving Goffman. But it's not really something that develops until after those founding fathers. And they essentially believe that you can't study sociology like a science. human life is too complex. There's too many variables to measure and too many things going on at once. It's not a controlled laboratory environment. So therefore, they place an emphasis on qualitative research. So that's the first one. So this is going over the quantitative research method first. So like scientists, quantitative approaches generally have aims of the research that are influenced by prior ideas or predictions. So quantitative approaches, remember that they're like scientists, and like most scientific studies, they have a hypothesis. So they have this view of really proving or disproving their own ideas. So let's say you're a Marxist and you employ a quantitative research approach, you might make some predictions that lead your sort of your inquiry, your research. So you might think as a Marxist, you want to explore the relationship between education system, or let's say instead of the education system, between employment and mental health, or people's economic position and mental health. Okay, so you have a prediction whether there is a correlation between that or not. That's a hypothesis there. And then in terms of samples, quantitative approaches generally have big samples that they're trying to represent the wider population. So it's not going to be small groups, it's going to be big samples. They might even be as ambitious to study thousands of people. Although it was a mixed methodology, so there's a bit of quantitative and qualitative. There was a famous one recently called the Great British Class Survey, and that took tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Brits, asking them about what class they identify with and what class stratification they are. So it's not just about the numbers, though, it's about representing the people within it. So it might be that 80% of your population are white Brits. So therefore you try and make 80% of your sample white British. It might be that, I know 40% are from the North. Okay, so you therefore make that a reflection in your sample. Or, gender, it might be a 50-50 split. You make sure you have 50-50 split. You try to do that as accurately as possible. Yes. And then the methodology, so it's trying to be standardized and accurate. And it's trying to complement statistical data. So it's going to be things where it's very closed off in terms of questions. It's very clear cut whether you've gone with what with your answer, essentially. So it might be a questionnaire, a structured questionnaire, that is, a structured interview, might be official statistics. And then in terms of results, you want data that's reliable and has clear correlations. So when I'm reliable, it's something that could be repeated and tested up against other things very clearly. So that's a quantitative approach. You might just want to pause it here and just note this all down if you haven't already. Okay, and then we have the qualitative approach. Okay, and it's generally it's the complete opposite. It's like day and night. So in terms of hypothesis, they don't always have prior aims or predictions, and they often want to have an open approach. So they might want to know that they're studying an area. So let's use that example of poverty and fire. They might want to study that, but they don't necessarily have any prior predictions. They just sort of want to study it and leave their methodology open and their possibilities to research things open. And then in terms of their sample, generally is smaller. They're not interested in having big, large samples that are representative. So long as they've got a small group of people who can give it rich data and lots of detail, that's fine. And they do actually reflect the topic. And then moving on to the methodology. So like I said, they're encouraging rich detail and depth. They're not trying to limit or constrain people's answers. They want as much detail as possible. So not just yes or no answers or, multiple choice sort of answers. They want big depth interviews, They want observations. They want case studies. They want unstructured interviews, so it allows the interview just to flow without any sort of routine or script. And they want focus groups. And then in terms of results, so the qualitative methodologies, they're not worried about reliability. They don't want their data to be something that's easily replicable. So, or, something that could be repeated. They don't want data that reflects the wider population. They just want data that is high in validity, high in depth. Very much detail rich rather. So in terms of the theories that support each approach, so generally, now, like I said, this is a bit of a generalization, overly simplistic, but generally it's structuralists who are associated with positivism. So those macro approaches to sociology. So you've got the functionalists, the Marxists, and you right, the feminists. In fact, Augustus Comte, who we looked at in the very first lesson, who considered sociology to be a science, he was himself really very similar to some of these functionalist ideas. And Durkheim and Marx themselves, they wanted to study sociology like a science. And then on the flip side of that, you have the interpretivists, or the qualitative approach, which is generally associated with social action and interactionist approaches, so micro-sociology. You do have some feminist topics that are associated with interpretivism, but I think that really depends on what the topic is, and if it's let's say it's a sensitive issue that they're studying, they don't want it to be a big sort of cold and heartless questionnaire. They want it to be intimate, in small groups, to build rapport with perhaps the people who are doing the research. So this is the last column for you to write down. So just match up which theories go with what approaches, which one is it, quantitative or qualitative? Okay, so we can look at some scenarios now. And as we go through each scenario, I would just like for you to identify whether they're quantitative or qualitative, and really to home in on, do they have a hypothesis? What sort of samples do they use? What methods they use? What results are they looking for? And if you can as well, try and identify what the theoretical approach is. Okay, so I'm just going to put them on the screen. I'm just going to let you read through them, and you might want to pause the video as well, and then we'll come back to it and discuss. So scenario one, I'm just going to read through it again. I'm sure you've looked through it now. Brian believes that there is a link between class inequality and depression. Brian intends to send 50,000 structured questionnaires in the post with a range of questions about their income and mental state. The approach intends to have research with clear and trustworthy statistical data. So overall, it is a quantitative approach. So I'm just going to identify how I knew that. So first off, Brian has a hypothesis. He thinks there's a link between class inequality and depression. In terms of the sample as well, it's a massive one. It's got 50,000 people in there, so it's looking to be representative. The methodology is a structured questionnaire, so it's very sort of organized and regimented, as it were. And then it goes on to talk about it intends for the research to be clear and trustworthy and statistical data. So that's what type of results it's looking for. And then in terms of for the stretch and challenge, what theory it may be associated with, that may be associated with Marxist theory. Okay, so again, you might want to pause it for scenario 2 and scenario 3 if you haven't already, and I'll go through those. Right, so in scenario 2, Emily believes that there has been a rise in social issues, such as crime, that have coincided with reforms to the education system. The research will conduct structured interviews on both teachers and police officers in an attempt to establish a correlation. So again, this is a quantitative approach, and although it's worded in a different way, that's intentional. It's trying to divert you really, and not just see the framework of scenario one. So there's a hypothesis. Emily does believe that there is a link between crime and educational reforms. It doesn't talk about the sample, but it talks about structured interviews. So again, it's very formal. If it was unstructured, it might be implied it's qualitative, but it's not. And again, it's talking about establishing correlation, so clear results. And in terms of the theory it might be associated with, well, there could be a range of things, but really it might be functionalist theory, because it's really alluding to sort of like this anomie through educational reforms that leads to issues like crime rates increasing. And then finally, we've got scenario 3. So Dave is interested in studying peer interaction at schools. Dave intends to use a mix of covert observation and unstructured interviews with 10 students at his local school. He is not sure what his findings will bring, so long as they are rich in detail. So yeah, it's qualitative. I'm just going to go through how I know that. So is there a hypothesis? No, it says that it's studying peer interaction at schools, but it's not really got two variables, and it's not really got a prediction about it. We also know this through the methodology, so it's all very much detail orientated. You know, it wants covert observations and unstructured interviews. It's not looking for closed off questions. And the sample's really small. It's only 10 students. And then to finish off, the results itself is looking for rich in detail. Okay, so we're slowly but surely we're applying the characteristics associated with the two approaches based on the hypothesis, sample, methodology, and results. Okay, we're starting to understand what a quantitative and a qualitative approach might look like. So just going to pause this. This is the last task. You might want to pause it yourself and just answer these questions. We're just really going to test your knowledge and see what you got, what you've really learned from this lesson, what maybe you need to go back and work on. So just pause the video and then we'll go through it in a couple of minutes. Right, so what are two main methodologies called? Well, that's a quantitative and a qualitative methodology. So number 2, which methodology generally has no hypothesis? Well, that's a qualitative methodology. Number 3, which methodology generally wants a representative sample? That's quantitative. Remember, they're trying to be like normal sciences. Number 4, which methodology is more likely to use structured interviews and questionnaires? That's quantitative again. Remember, they want closed questions. They want high reliability, things that could be repeated. And then finally, which approach is more interested in validity rather than reliable data? Well, that's a qualitative approach. Remember, they want depth in their results, not necessarily reliability and representativeness. And then stretch and challenge structurists are more likely to employ what approach? Remember, it's macro, it's associated with positivism, being like a science, being quantitative. Brilliant. Right. So the next lesson we'll be looking at the difference between sex and gender, and then race and ethnicity. And then there may be another lesson on there with a little bit of a sort of a recap of the unit before the end of unit assessment, and that can be used for revision.